Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking up with Empyre number 0. For those of you guys who don't know, Empyre is like the big event that Marvel's doing, or at least one of them. They're also doing like an X-Men centric event, but Empyre's kind of a big one. Now, in the midst of everything that's been going on, it's kind of flown under the radar, right? Not a whole lot of advertising going on because there's no real comics coming out. And as we know, comic book companies don't really advertise on TV. This whole scenario, this whole thing is cool, right? Because this is kind of my bread and butter, right? This whole situation, at least in terms of the history and the story that's being told, right? So this initially picks up with the slaughter of the Cotati, right? The entire Cotati race is being massacred here. And it's kind of wild, right? In terms of them just being killed in such a brutal way, right? The garden on the moon is kind of how it's referred to. Now, the reality is that all this is really Tony Stark kind of waking up from a dream. And there's a couple different things going on here. The first is that Tony Stark recalls that this is basically how the Kree-Skrull War started, insofar as it was told to him during the events of the Kree-Skrull War. But the other thing to understand here is kind of what's not shown, like what's not explicitly stated here. And so the way this played out, for those of you guys who are curious, the reason why the Cotati matter and the reason why this is kind of important is because in the early days, not really even the early days of Earth, but like millions of years ago, right? The Skrull race was basically a peaceful race. Now, they had gone through all kinds of crazy situations, right? They had gone through all kinds of different scenarios and so on. You had the Celestials experimenting on them, different things like that. But the way that played out, to kind of give you a brief little history there, like you had the Skrull as a race. They were met by the arrival of the Celestials in the same way that Earth was, 30,000 years ago, but for them it was much longer before. The Celestials broke their race into thirds. They experimented on them. You got the Deviants, you got the Eternals, and then you got the baseline Skrulls. You also got the Dire Wraiths, but that's a whole different kettle of beans, right? The Dire Wraiths are amazing. They were just like this force of destruction across the universe. But the idea here was that, unlike Earth, where we ended up seeing that the Deviants were ultimately not really annihilated, but certainly pushed to the brink of extinction by the Celestials at a future point in time, the Deviants actually ended up coming out on top in the Skrull homeworld, right? So basically all the Eternal Skrulls, and for the most part the baseline Skrulls, were essentially wiped out, and the Deviant Skrulls were the ones who reigned supreme. Now, after generations, eventually the Deviant Skrulls found their inner peace, basically, and then they started charting the spaceways, and that led to them creating this massively expansive empire. Now, in an effort to expand their empire and to bring other races in, they traveled to the homeworld of Hala. And Hala at the time was occupied by, as most of you guys know, the Kree, but also occupied by the Cotati. And the Cotati are basically like Groot, except they have leaves, right? That's really the only difference between them. But what ended up happening is the Skrulls took a segment of each population and then created the blue area of the moon. Now, the blue area of the moon is a section of the moon where it has oxygen, and they were dropped off there. And the idea was that they were told, basically, you have 1 year to use whatever resources you can find here to build something. And then when we come back, we will judge your creations and determine whether or not you're suitable to be part of the Skrull homeworld. Oh, and also, only one of you can join. This led to the 1 year period passing. The Skrulls returned, and when they did, they found that like the Kree had built some kind of big citadel or something like that, right? Some big gaudy fancy monstrosity, and the Cotati had built this lush jungle. Well, because the Skrulls were peaceful, they sided with the Cotati. The Kree were pissed. They ended up killing all the Cotati on the moon. They killed the entire Skrull delegation, which I believed included the king, reverse engineered their technology, flew back to Hala, and then basically started building their own warships and wiped out all the Cotati on Hala at the same time, or at least most of them. And then because of the fact that they killed the Skrull king, this led to the beginning of the Kree-Skrull War, right? And it's just been waging on for millions of years, right? It really is just kind of like a blood feud in a lot of ways. But that's really what this whole preview segment is, right? Now, the reason why that matters and the reason that's important is because around the time that Tony Stark wakes up, he's suddenly met by a message from Carol Danvers, right? Who basically says, we have a kind of SOS on the moon. We need to go over there and figure out what's going on, right? So the Avengers end up hopping aboard one of their ships. They travel out there to the moon. One of the other things I kind of want to point out here is Thor. We can largely assume that this story takes place after the beginning, or at least the first arc of Thor, but we can also kind of assume it takes place before, right? Because as we know, Thor is essentially the king of Asgard, and so it seems that, most likely as that role, he would stay on Asgard, which is kind of what he'd been doing, as opposed to leaving it. So I think it takes place after the first arc, or the one where he becomes a Herald of Galactus. We can largely assume it takes place after that. This is one of those murky situations that we see from time to time. This is one of the issues that you have when you have a solo book involving a character, and what's going on doesn't really seem to match up with a team book. Marvel's been doing this for years, but it's one of the things that you just kind of run into. It doesn't really matter. It's just Thor's there, but you also have Black Panther, you've got She-Hulk, you got Captain America, Steve Rogers, you got a few things going on. But when they arrive there, they end up finding out that this blue area of the moon has basically been developed by the Cotati. Now you'll also notice that the entire citadel of the Watcher is basically gone or kind of, covered in plant life and so on. Remember, the Watcher Uatu, he's been dead ever since Original Sin, right? He's been dead for a long time. So his whole space station and area is kind of abandoned. Marvel will bring him back eventually, right? And everything will kind of go back to the way that it used to be. But in the interim, he's gone, right? So the whole place I guess it's basically squatters' rights is really what it amounts to at this point in time. But when they arrive there, Captain America immediately picks up on something, that he's been in all different kinds of jungles across Earth. And in this jungle, there's no signs of life, right? There's no insects, right? There's no bugs, there's no animals, no nothing. It's just a jungle with absolutely no signs of life. And the blue area of the moon can sustain that life. So right off the bat, Captain America knows it's not an Earth-based experiment, right? It's not like some kind of Earth experiment that was going on, that was happening at the hands of like Roxxon oil and somehow went bad or something along those lines. But in the midst of all that, they're suddenly met by the arrival of a Kree Sentry. Now, the Kree Sentries were cool. Back in the day, they were pretty interesting. Marvel hasn't used them in years. In fact, I think the last time they had any real role in Marvel Comics was during Annihilation Conquest. After that, they just kind of appear every once in a while. But the Kree Sentries were designed for the purpose of basically fighting in the stead of Kree soldiers if necessary, and if unnecessary, basically just bolstering their forces, right? That was the idea behind it. And that's what you got with the Kree Sentries, right? These things are powerful enough to take down an entire army, right? I mean, they're crazy, right? You send one Kree Sentry on Earth, it would obliterate most of the heroes on Earth. Now, people like Thor, other people out there, Incredible Hulk, who are exceedingly strong and could physically subdue a Kree Sentry, they'll do fine. But like 90% of the Earth superheroes would fall. But it basically takes the combined forces of the Avengers to hold off as best they can, right? It's not really outright defending it, it's just doing the best they can to take it out. And then suddenly, they're met by the arrival of some mysterious guy who chops off the head of the Kree Sentry, this kind of plant-based head more or less, and then basically tells the Avengers to attack. They do, they finish the job, and the Kree Sentry's destroyed. Then the question becomes, who in the heck is this guy? And then suddenly Thor immediately recognizes who this guy is, right? That he was an old Avenger, an old school Avenger, and that he's basically a guy that Thor welcomes. Now, this is not one of these scenarios where Marvel's introducing a new character and we had just never seen him before. We've seen this guy before. This is Swordsman, or at least kind of Swordsman, but not really. Swordsman back in the day, he sucked, right? I mean, he wasn't very interesting at all. He was kind of crappy. He was a guy who basically, I think he gained a lot of his skills from like circus acts and so on and so forth. He was an insanely talented acrobat. He trained Hawkeye, different things like that. It's one of these things where he basically got too big for his britches. He was sent into the Avengers to basically become a mole, and he ended up falling in love with Scarlet Witch, and then something else ended up happening, but he ended up basically defying his mission and then was killed in the process. And the reason why this matters is because what the Cotati managed to do was basically resurrect him. Now, this is the danger of what's going on in Marvel Comics right now. When Jonathan Hickman launched the X-Men, and Jonathan Hickman came up with this idea of having the 5 lights, or the 5, whatever you want to call them, who can serve the purpose of resurrecting old X-Men, Hickman did it in a way where it was very controlled, right? It's very much like it has to have a purpose and it has to have a reason for why that person's coming back. Swordsman sucks. Nobody ever wanted Swordsman to come back. There's nobody out there in the history of Marvel Comics who ever sat down and said, man, you know who I want to see come back? Swordsman. I want to see Jacques Duquesne, or whatever, however you pronounce his name. I want to see him come back because he was just so cool. Like, nobody said that. And that's kind of the issue that you run into, resurrecting people for the sake of a story. Now, it could just be this is a one-off. This is all we get. But it's issue number 0. It's way too early to tell, right? It's much too early to be a naysayer, but it is a little bit of a concern. But the overall gist is that you end up having a Swordsman who basically, reveals that he ended up having a child, essentially with Mantis. That child is basically Sequoia. But ultimately, Sequoia was introduced as basically the son of Mantis and kind of a Cotati hybrid. We didn't really know the significance of his character, but what's being done now is basically saying that this guy is kind of a spiritual leader of the Cotati, and that he will ultimately lead the universe into a place where he's going to get rid of all evil, right? Which is somewhat of a bold statement. Now, this comic is basically narrated by Iron Man, and when he hears that, his whole thought is like, that's kind of a crazy scenario, right? That's kind of a crazy thing. But seemingly, there hasn't really been a coronation of sorts, or a kind of baptism of sorts, to verify that Sequoia Sequoia is recognized in this capacity. At least that kind of seems to be the case. And so Thor, using his ability to control the weather, because of the fact that there's oxygen here, oxygen in turn means an atmosphere, which means weather. Thor uses his ability in order to create a kind of coronation event, more or less, and then basically baptizes this kid, you know, to kind of, that he's stepping into manhood, more or less. It's kind of the case, right? Because when Thor knew him, and when Thor, you know, helped this kid, he was a teenager, right? So, you know, now that he's kind of an adult, so not really a kid, it's kind of a coronation, basically saying like, you know, this is sort of a recognition of your power and your role and everything going on. And then we finally get an explanation of what in the heck is going on. And the big concern here is that if the Cotati are back, then why haven't the Kree attacked, right? Because the Kree have kind of like this vendetta against the Cotati. They hate them, right? They kill them everywhere they can find them, even the ones who escaped. And the explanation that's given here is that, you know, the Sentry that was fought against by the Avengers is half Skrull and half Kree. Well, then that begs the question, why do we have a half Skrull and half Kree Sentry running around? And the answer is the Kree and the Skrull now have an alliance. This race that's been fighting each other for millions of years are now allied in a singular cause. Now, if you've been reading Marvel Cosmic really since 2006, right, since Annihilation, and even if you go back and you read the old Kree-Skrull War by Roy Thomas, this is horrifying, right? Because what you have are two of the most powerful empires in the entirety of Marvel Comics allying themselves, right? So it's like, who could possibly stand against them? It would be like if Galactus and Thanos, you know, joined forces for the purpose of just like eradicating life, right? Like who, not, you know, let's not even say that, right? Because it's a little one-sided when you talk about that. Let's say Thanos with the Infinity Gauntlet and the Marquis of Death, right? Like if they allied with each other to like annihilate life across the cosmos, across the multiverse, who's gonna stop them? Right? Like nobody's going to stop them. And that's really kind of what this shows. It's like they've combined their forces. They've basically combined their entire armadas, right? So their entire fleets are brought together. So you're talking about this colossal war machine formed by the two biggest and probably most dangerous empires in the entirety of Marvel Comics. It's a big deal, right? Because then the question starts being asked, okay, like how do we respond to this, right? Now, Carol Danvers has stepped away as the leader of Alpha Flight and Abigail Brand has taken her place. That most likely happened because of the fact that that's what's going to happen in the MCU, that basically Carol Danvers is going to move away. She's not really going to be the leader of Alpha Flight. That she's going to be one of these people that kind of travels into space and whatever happens, or maybe she just stays on Earth as an Avenger. But Abigail Brand's going to be introduced, and that makes sense, right? Joss Whedon introduced her during his astonishing X-Men run. The MCU usually kind of goes with the traditional origins of concepts and then modifies them later on down the road. So that sort of makes sense what's going on. Plus, Abigail Brand was a more effective leader of Alpha Flight or Sword, right? She had the ability to speak every language in existence, right? So it kind of made sense that she's going to be a liaison for aliens out there because she can translate, understand their languages and so on. But the big fear here is that if the Kree and the Skrull are allying themselves and they're in turn heading for the moon, then are they going to head to Earth? Not only that, Iron Man kind of looks at this and says they're going to head for the Cotati, right? They're going to wipe out the entire Cotati race. And that's what Sequoia says. Their goal here is to kill us. The Kree hate us because it's the Kree and they hate us. And the Skrulls hate us because they see us as their great error. Had they not done what they did, you know, all these lives that would have been lost over the years would never have been lost in the first place. And so as a result of this, they've kind of allied. The Avengers basically come together, or at least the Avengers team as it exists now. And the response of Iron Man is, we will do whatever it takes to basically save the Cotati. Now I'm going to tell you guys right now, not a chance. This ragtag band of Avengers, despite how high profile they are going to stand a chance to take out the entire Kree and the Skrull armada. That's not going to happen, right? That's never going to happen. There's no possible chance that anybody with any rational mind would look at this and say, they definitely could do that, right? Like hundreds of thousands of ships, they could definitely take them out. Not a chance. But the idea of Iron Man is we're going to pull together and we're going to pull this off. So this indicates we're going to get a lot more characters involved here. And that's of course where the Empyre event expands. But where he also makes the comment, we don't care who it is that gets in our way. What we end up finding out, or at least the way it appears, that part of this armada that's basically been formed here has been formed by the Fantastic Four. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.